Hi, my name is Kris Buytaert, and today I'm going to talk about from monitoring sucks to monitoring love and back. And basically, I'm going to ask the question, did we fix or break monitoring and thus observability? So, who am I? Ages ago, I was a software developer. I wrote code in languages like Java and Perl and even C. And at some point in my career, I became an operations person because I was the only one who knew how to cluster an application and how to actually rack machines. The last couple of years, I've been running O11y, which is an open source observability consultancy based out of Belgium. Next to doing the open source observability, I've been organizing DevOps days since the very first edition we had in Ghent in 2009. I've started Config Management Camp, which is also a long time running conference for the past over a decade now, and some smaller events. But most people remember me from the title of my blog, which is Everything is a Freaking DNS Problem. And typically they point at me and they curse when they realize that I've been right again and that what they're facing actually is a DNS problem again. Oh yeah, and DNS obviously stands for DevOps Needs Sushi, because that's how we share and we collaborate. You can find me on socials, mostly with the Kris Buytaert nickname on GitHub, Mastodon, and some others. So, yeah. I mentioned O11y. O11y is a spin-off from Inuit. Inuit is one of the largest open source consultancies in Europe. We're about 150 people across a number of different countries. And at O11y, what we do is we mostly support the Prometheus ecosystem, but the whole ecosystem. And we have professional support and services around that. We maintain the long-term support, stable release for Prometheus. And we're hacking on some stuff in the background. So let me take you back in history. Let's have a look at where we come from regarding open source observability and monitoring. If I go back, I don't even go back that long. It's only 16, 17 years when Ottawa Linux Symposium was still one of the larger open source conferences in the world. And back in those days, you still had to write a paper that you could present at the conference. And what we did in 2008 was we wrote a paper comparing a lot of the open source monitoring tools and figured out which ones were usable, which ones were not usable. The result of that research was basically that it was a large number of bloated Java tools that were eating more memory than the tools and the applications we were monitoring. There was a lot of dysfunctional open core software where the functionality you really wanted was not available. Then there were a couple of interesting open source tools, but they weren't really scaling. I mean, you needed a DBA if you wanted to monitor just a rack of machines back in those days. And that's not even that much. That's 42 servers, right? And there was Nagios. And in the open source world, Nagios was the king. It was a tool that everybody still used. Some of us loved it, some of us hated it. But the hate was not that much about the tool. It was more about how the community interacted with its main developer. Fast forward a couple of years, and John Vincent, Lucis on Twitter, in 2011 tweeted, "Monitoring sucks." And he was right. But also, heck no. He said, monitoring is awesome. Metrics are awesome. He loved it. But he also hated it because he had his hands tied and he couldn't do things the way he wanted. He had to set up fake hosts to do monitoring and to do metrics together. He sometimes had to do metric collection twice or more. And he didn't really have choice. So he really didn't like not having choices. So we set up a GitHub project and we started listing all the tools we wanted, all the features we wanted, the new things that popped up. And in a way, the monitoring sucks movement was a sub-movement of the DevOps movement where we talked about that M part in the CAMS keyword, about monitoring, about open source, about observability. We even had hackathons at our office back in the days in Antwerp, where we had a bunch of people who were really deep into open source monitoring, like set out and discuss what we really wanted in a tool. But if we take a real look at why monitoring really sucked at that point in time, it was that a lot of those tools were configured manually from a user interface. They were absolutely not in sync with reality. Like somebody added something, it was not being monitored. A lot of those tools were focusing on the hosts only. Sometimes we were looking at the services, and most often we were not looking at the application at all. Basically, everything was out of sync. So we got alert fatigue. And then maybe we fixed a couple of alerts, but we got alert fatigue because we got alerts for things that weren't really useful. We got alerts for things that we shouldn't be monitoring anymore, and that kind of stuff. So monitoring really, really sucked, and we were tired of it. A new bunch of tools popped up, different ways of looking at monitoring. Things like Sensu that used queuing rather than straight going to the host and checking things. Nagios got forked a zillion times. One of the forks actually survived and became a really healthy community, like a Kinga. We had tools that built on top of RRD and built on top of real good metric systems and allowed us to really quickly dig into metrics. Tools like Graphite, which gave us a really fast way to get graphs from systems and learn, and also a really trivial way to get metrics in there. Like you could just echo a string to a port and that gave you a metric, and it was awesome. And we had things like Jordan Sissel's Logstash, which rather than had us on our syslog server where we didn't do anything anymore with the logs, we could actually start using those logs to learn. So we evolved from basic health checks to using our logs and metrics to actually do forecasts and analytics on the data we had. And then not even that long after John Vincent tweeted monitoring sucks, Ulf Manson at DevOps Days Rome in 2011, he gave an ignite about his newfound love for monitoring. It was awesome. He had his slides drawn by his children, and he was really talking about his newfound love, like the combination of new open source tools, in his case, that was Sensu, and automation. And that is really what, for a lot of people, brought back the monitoring love. Like the combination of having a new tool which we could automate completely, where we had a single source of truth that was the code and the state of the infrastructure, where we could say, hey, if we change a new thingy here, if we provision something, our monitoring is going to be automatically updated. We're not going to have somebody a week later figure out, hey, we forgot to add this monitoring. It's going to be in the code. So both provisioning a new resource, changing that resource, or decommissioning that resource would reflect in a change in our monitoring solutions. And it would allow us to keep the dashboards green. And we created a new culture based on automating and open source monitoring tools where people wanted to be on call, because when that page came in, it actually was an interesting challenge they wanted to be part of. And it was not something that should already have been fixed. So it was all fun, right? We were all drinking cocktails on the beach and time for retirement. The thing is, we fixed monitoring for a lot of us, but it wasn't even distributed. Not at all. Some of us got to observability. Some of us got to get real good insights into how our infrastructures and applications behaved. But most of us were still stuck behind. And then things changed. Cloud happened, containers happened. And people said, we need to change the way we think about monitoring. We need to only look at the metric. And a new tool popped up, Prometheus. And the arguments were like, yeah, but traditional monitoring systems cannot deal with the constant change in resources. Or we need to look at it different. We don't need to look anymore at, is this thing just on? We also need to look at the error rates and how good the quality is. And for some people, that was it. Yeah, that's good, but that's only valid for containers. But there's a bunch of troubles with Prometheus. Like most people, when they set it up, forget about their data retention. They just take the default. And where in Graphite we had ages of data, now we suddenly lost that data. Not because of Prometheus not supporting it, but because of people not configuring it correctly. We needed to figure out new ways to deal with accessing our targets as SSL. We actually started abusing the black box exporter as a binary check to, hey, is this thing still on? And a lot of the alerts and the defaults and the dashboards that were out there were really not up to the level that we tuned them before. So we lost a lot of context. And we DDoSed ourselves with basically getting way too much metrics in place by using full MySQL exporter configs and stuff like that. And also, we in a way lost our single source of truth. For a lot of ecosystems, there was no relations anymore between the checks and the services. It was all manually crafted again. Except if you were in a Kubernetes ecosystem. There things were at least a bit more automated. Prom operator helped. But if you weren't using that ecosystem, you were left out, which basically means the majority of the industry was left out. We were thinking and thought about, well, you need to think and work with SLOs. But what if you don't need them? Is an SLO actually actionable? If you don't meet a certain quality, what can you do about it? And the reality is that most of the organizations don't have the right culture to implement such an approach. They don't have their teams empowered to make those changes or even to enforce them to teams upstream. So now we have SLOs, which are as virtual as SLAs, which is basically a secret lying agreement, and we are not really using them. So it doesn't work for everybody. You are not Google. You're not Facebook. Well, maybe you are, but chances are you aren't. So what we saw is that every couple of years, this new fancy tool pops up. In this case, Prometheus. And it's awesome. But organizations don't change the way they work. They don't change the way that application really has to be used. And while it's supposed to be a replacement of another tool, it actually ends up being the second tool that needs to be managed right next to the other one. So we fail. And we keep doing this over and over again. Back in 2014, we had our logs, we stored them all, we used derived metrics, and we looked at how they behaved. We had a perfect point to start discussion between devs and ops. We had them structured. They were massive, and we learned a lot until we didn't have the time anymore, until they broke, until the development teams didn't have time anymore, and the dashboards broke. And typically, we didn't have the right structures in place because changing the log formats was not something that was on the backlog of the teams. We had those derived metrics, and people ignored them. And managing those stacks was complex and time-consuming. We had the same with tracing in the early days, like lack of standardization, like what did we need to do? Open tracing, open census, Zipkin? I don't know. Then some proprietary vendor popped up and says, hey, this works out of the box. And the developer says, nope, it doesn't. It doesn't work for our language. Like, it took a really long time for some of the most popular languages like PHP to be really useful. Slowly they are. But even 1 or 2 years ago, they were still not stable. They were still not in there. And we started DDoSing ourselves. And we had to learn all over again. There was no magic. There was no, just turn this on and it works. You needed to do some orchestration. And luckily, things like OpenTelemetry started to help out. And if you look at all of these tags, complexity really was the enemy of reliability. Like, getting metrics there meant to have a massive amount of custom exporter, set up Prometheus and Alert Manager, Grafana, figuring out long-term storage like Cortex, Thanos, Memer, like which one to even choose, and keeping those alerts relevant. For logs, there was the same thing. We have Logstash combined with Fluentd, Bit, whatever. We have an Olk stack, we have Loki. Which one to choose? And the same again with traces. You need Jaeger, you need something to store them in. It's getting a lot of work to get all those things going. And when we jokingly said below the Java that took more resources than the application we were monitoring, we're not far off. And all of that was not really integrated. Compared it to playing with Lego, it's like you can go out and buy a box and get the instruction. It's all pretty pre-packaged, and you get it and you build it. Or you can go to Bricklink and buy all of the individual pieces and piece them together. Sure, you'll find a manual somewhere, but it's a different experience. And people prefer to buy the prepackaged box. So yeah, when John Vincent said monitoring sucks, he had a couple of arguments. At some point, we were exactly back there. Like a black box exporter, that was the fake host, right? Faking services. How many times do we actually collect some metrics and then use another way to do it? John Vincent was asking about having to choose between different intervals, the number of dashboards that broke in Prometheus because the scrape intervals were not aligned, or having to choose between two interfaces. I wanted a dream where Kibana and Grafana actually would migrate and collaborate and become together. And yeah, is your Kubernetes cluster that single source of truth? I mean, it isn't. So it wasn't really a choice. I mean, yeah, you could go to really, really expensive proprietary hosted solutions. That was a choice. And then I remember PacketBeat. Not sure if you still remember, but this was basically a screenshot from PacketBeat before they got acquired by Elastic. It gave me insight on a pretty raw level in my applications. I could drill down to what I wanted to see, how applications talk to each other, and see the impact of an HTTP request all the way through a SQL command at the same point. And it was awesome. But it never reached the next release. The things that were interesting in Packet never got to the next release. And that was sad. So the magic, maybe there's different approaches. eBPF gave us, I like to call eBPF a marriage of strace and TCP and TCP dump on steroids. Like, it's a framework again. It's something that allows you to attach to really low-level things. It's a framework. It's a framework to build a monitoring tool. And maybe that is the magic. Maybe when that tool showed up, we could start building things again. We could start to really have only one source. So we saw tools pop up that were using eBPF. And it was really easy when you looked at the tools out there on Kubernetes. But it was really hard outside. And let's be real. Yes, Kube is relevant for a number of things, but it's not the one-size-fits-all tool that has already magically replaced everything which is in our ecosystems. A lot of the tools, a lot of the platforms, a lot of the applications that businesses run and build and earn their money on have not been migrated to Kube and maybe never will because they don't fit the architecture. And we want those same features. We want those things also on those platforms. So there's a variety of tools that you can choose, that you can play with. Native stuff, get it integrated, focus on a bunch of security focuses. But the last time I did my research, more than half of them were really focusing on Kubernetes. And if you were not using Kubernetes, there was no use case. So I was really happy that at some point I bumped into Coroot. And it actually allowed me to do all of that stuff on bare metal, on Kube. It's a really easy setup. It's an agent and a server. It's eBPF based. It ships all the things. It's one thing that does metrics, logs, and traces. It does profiling for a number of languages. It's really zero instrumentation. I mean, it needs your per project, it needs the backend. It uses Prometheus and ClickHouse in the back. But it really helped me. And it got me back to what Packetbeat did. Like, these are the map, the connection of what applications talk to each other, how they collaborate. And it really brought me back that, yeah, this is what I want to see. This is how it helps. And for me, Co-Root is that tool that brought back my, you want to call it O11y love? Let's call it O11y love, because it fits every ecosystem. It's a really simple agent to deploy, and it gives me insights, the observability insights into my ecosystem in minutes, and I get fast feedback from the developers as well. So yeah, I've always loved monitoring done right, automated with open source tool, but now, after a couple of years of fighting with a lot of open source observability tools, there's now also my love for observability back. And I think that is the goal for a lot of us out there. Find that one tool we love, find that tool that actually helps us automating things and gives us back the insights in our ecosystem that we need so much. So yeah, we fixed it. And then we broke it again. And for some of us, it's fixed again. So let's fix open source monitoring and observability once again, and then take us to the next stage. But remember, this industry runs in circles. So yeah, we might break it again. Even that DevOps Days Amsterdam visitor, they're gonna break it again. So let's be careful when we try to introduce new monitoring tools. Do it the right way. Thank you.